Funding for this program is made possible by the Pittsburgh Foundation. Thank you.
Gun violence, it's a problem not just in our cities, but in rural areas too. And recent mass shootings, including the one here at Western Psych, have put gun violence and gun laws in the spotlight, making it a public safety issue for everyone. Tonight, in this community forum, we'll examine the cost of gun violence on our communities, on our young people, on our families.
I'm gonna miss him becoming a man and a father. That's what breaks my heart.
Who's dying? Where are the guns coming from?
These kids can get a gun, but they can't get cigarettes.
Are the laws working? Is society doing enough?
They seen it, they witnessed it, and they said nothing.
And how can we do more? Good evening, I'm Michael Bartley.
I'm Tonya Caruso. Welcome to the Fred Rogers studio at WQED for this community forum on gun violence.
We're streaming this program live on our website, WQED.org. Chris Moore is standing by to begin our panel discussion.
We've also invited an audience, many of whom have been touched by this issue. In fact, by the end of today, 32 Americans will have been murdered by someone using a gun.
And that's one of the reasons we're here tonight, and why this community forum is just one element of WQED's ongoing project, Gun Violence, Victims and Voices for Change. In our first of two documentaries, we focused on the victims.
He was just that kind of kid you like to be with.
Mary and Harry Schaub lost both of their children to gun violence. Daughter Nancy was shot by her boyfriend in 2010. Not even 2 years later, Michael Schaub was working as a therapist at Western Psych in Oakland when a gunman opened fire with two semi-automatic handguns.
And then I seen a state police undercover car pull around my house, and I'm like, oh. Then he stopped and he said, Harry. I go, yeah. And he goes, can I speak to you? And I knew. I did it before. My daughter was the state police. I knew what they were going to tell me. And they told me. I said, don't tell me. He goes, I have to.
In the summer of 2006, Tiona Lachey, who was only 14 at the time, was at a church festival in Brighton Heights when a gunfight broke out. Tiona was shot in the back and is now paralyzed from the waist down.
I spent maybe, within the past 8 years, I've spent maybe 5 years in the hospital altogether, maybe even 6. Like if you just put all the time together.
What do you miss?
I would definitely have to say dancing. I think that's what I miss the most.
In our second documentary, we looked at gun laws and the debate between the Second Amendment and public safety.
Put the sights on the target.
It's not a privilege. It's a fundamental right.
Focus on the front sight.
If you mess with it, you better have a good reason.
Now press the trigger.
We're not against the Second Amendment. We're not trying to change it. We really are interested in keeping illegal guns off the streets and away from people who shouldn't have them.
We examined the topic of mental illness and how it now relates to the gun debate.
And I think that in the incidences we do know of where there has been a tragedy and an act of violence, and we know that the person did have a mental illness or a history of a mental illness, we know that it was untreated. And that, I think, is the operative word. It was untreated.
A guy came up behind me and hit me in the back of the head with a pistol, pushed me onto the ground and held the gun to my head.
And this website is another part of our project. People from all over are filling this page with their personal stories of how gun violence has impacted them.
I have pain every moment of every day. My family suffered, my kids have suffered, my fiance suffered, my whole life has changed.
And those personal web stories are an ongoing part of our project.
And here's how you can share your story about how gun violence has impacted you. Upload your recorded video to YouTube or Vimeo, then paste the link on our special gun violence webpage. Here's the address. It's wqed.org/gunviolence.
Well, thank you, Michael and Tonya. This project includes documentaries, web stories, and now this live forum. Let's introduce our panel. Kevin McCarthy is a veteran assistant district attorney in Allegheny County. Marita Bryant is assistant chief at the City of Pittsburgh Bureau of Police. Larry Likar is a retired FBI agent and chair of the Department of Justice, Law, and Security at LaRoche College. Pittsburgh City Councilman Reverend Ricky Burgess represents District 9, which includes the East Hills and Homewood. And Kim Stouffer is the chairman of the group Firearm Owners Against Crime. Reverend Burgess, I'd like to start with you. With all the talk about gun control, you have adopted a unique kind of approach to this in that you want gun sensing microphones and cameras in your district to help crack down on gun violence. Why have you taken that tack rather than the traditional methods that we see about the Second Amendment?
Well, first of all, as you know, my life has been a reaction to gun violence. I've had aunts, my cousins, my wife's mother, my mother-in-law, my brother-in-law has spent 22 years in incarceration for committing a homicide. I've had members of my church. I've heard shots on my porch. I've done the funerals of church members who have been shot and killed. And so for me, it's very personal. And so when looking at my community, I also, with Mayor Luke Ravenstahl, initiated the Pittsburgh Initiative to Reduce Crime. And it was a comprehensive way to look at gun violence and try to reduce it. But the recent incidents in my community where there were just a series of gunfire and gunshots and gun killing meant that we had to do something different. And so one of the ways to deter crime, we believe, is to set up this series in my district of a 3-mile radius of gunshot detection system along with a camera system that's connected to the gunshot detective system, so that if the gunshot is fired, within 30 seconds, the police will know where it came from, the caliber, how many shots were fired, and then the cameras that are connected to the sound system will automatically pan in the direction of where the gunfire came in, so that if there is any egress or degress or someone comes from that area, they will likely be caught on camera. In other cities that this has happened, it has reduced gunshots by 30 to 40%. The camera systems linked with the gunshot detective system is relatively new. Will be about the 4th city in the country who has adopted this system. I'm looking forward to its implementation this summer. I absolutely believe it will stop gunfire in some ways. It will reduce homicides and will give the police, I believe, the extra tools they need to commit, to catch the people who commit crimes. Because in the communities I represent, they're afraid of gunfire, but they're also afraid to tell. And they're also afraid of the police.
Well, that's a whole nother subject we'll get into, but let me turn to Assistant Chief Bryant right now. Do you think that this will aid it? It sounds like it might not prevent gunfire or gunshots or gun violence, but it might help your forces in tracking down the guilty parties.
I think it will be a positive tool that we can use in a community where people become accustomed to gunfire. And when they don't call the police, this is a tool that the police can go to the location where the gunfire is heard. Oftentimes there could be police cars right in the vicinity, but the sound of the gunfire, when it bounces off of buildings, you don't know exactly where it is. And the system that Reverend Burgess is talking about will put officers within 3 feet of where the shot was fired.
So someone might be apprehended sooner, you think?
Yes, that is the tool that will work for us.
And what about as an investigative tool, Mr. McCarthy, and convicting a ne'er-do-well or someone who is committing these kinds of crimes? Will you then have an audio and video record to prosecute the perpetrator?
Possibly, but the way I understand the camera system will work, it's after the shots have been fired, so it's likely that the persons in the vicinity would be picked up by the cameras. As we know from experience with the cameras that we have now in place, oftentimes people have hoodies, they have ball caps, it masks them in some way. But what it does do, it gets the police on site sooner to apprehend them, and that's more important than anything else, that we have a quick apprehension of the suspect.
All right, let's go down to Kim Stouffer with Firearm Owners Against Crime. Kim, I've interviewed you a number of times. You tell me many of these new laws won't work, that what we need to do is put the 6% of the people who commit repeat crimes behind jail and keep them there. But is that too much of the lock them up and throw away the key attitude, or would that really work in your opinion?
Well, I think when you talk to lying police officers, what you're going to find is that they're going to tell you they know who's committing most of the gun crime. Matter of fact, the local newspaper's article back in the late 90s, early 2000s, actually identified 150 people that continue the revolving door of justice and commit the bulk, 70% of violent crime with guns. So it's not really smoke and mirrors to say that you want to take and hold the criminal and stop him from perpetrating a new line of crime.
So we need no new laws, just enforce the laws that are on the books?
That's what I'm told, and that's what my research has told me. I mean, I'm no spring chicken to this discussion. I've been looking at this for over 30 years. And what I found is that everybody wants to have a safe society, and so do I. I have 2 boys. My wife and I like to go out for walks. I like to go visit parks. But who wants to go out there and carry a gun because you're afraid that the police are inundated and can't get to you when you need help? And that's what we're trying to say, is let's take a look at the documents from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, like I do, like Larry works with. Let's take a look and see what works and what doesn't.
All right. Let's look at that. Larry Leicar, you've done a lot of research in this area. Do you have any statistical information about what works and what does not work, especially when we're talking about mental health issues, when we're talking about magazine capacity, when we're talking about the rapidity of a weapon and how often it can fire, when we're talking about who commits the crimes?
There's the basic problem with looking at gun violence is that the act itself, the act of using a weapon to commit a violent crime, that act has a multiplicity of factors involved in the decision to do that. The gun is just, it facilitates the act. So it's very hard to determine when we come up with various forms of intervention, including new laws, including restrictions on weapons. It's very hard to determine whether or not that worked or not. Most of the research we've had in this field so far has been rather sparse. None of it has been found to be definitive as to what exactly would work out there. One thing about using what would be a form of situational crime prevention, which is the cameras are, is that they will be able to determine when they institute that program whether or not the rate goes down. And since you only have one factor you're looking at, you're going to have an idea as to whether or not that worked. Whenever we pass laws, one of the problems is whether or not, how do you know that the law was effective or not in reducing gun violence?
Does it take a long time to tell?
It does, and in fact, when we've done that, looking at a comparative basis of various states, it never matches.
Kim, you're nodding your head. You agree?
I agree with Larry that it is. It's not a immediate solution to any problem.
The laws, you mean?
Yeah. Because you have to look, you have to talk to the experts, like Larry, like criminologists.
I talk to people, and we've seen in the documentaries that Tonya and Michael have produced that 90% of the people in this country want something done. Are you saying that passing a new law on magazine capacity or background checks is the wrong thing to do when people want this done?
Because we don't know if anything would have worked to stop that. For instance, the shootings at that school up in Sandy Hook. He chose that school because he said none of the kids could fight back. And this is afterwards, months afterwards. And he chose that school because it was a gun-free zone. Gun-free zones with schools have promoted violence.
Promoted violence?
Yes.
What do you mean?
Well, because from 1996, when it was instituted by senators, what they actually did was is they promoted it because now no one on that, none of the parents, no visitors can possess a firearm that's legally
So they can't
licensed
protect
to them.
themselves or the children, and you think that promotes violence?
Well, look at the numbers. Up till 1996, there were an average of 11 school shootings.
So
From
you think these are
1996
target-rich environments that criminals take advantage of because they know no one can carry a gun on the premises?
The facts don't lie.
Okay. Mr. McCarthy, I'd like to ask you about crime. We're doing this program because there's a perception, and I don't know if it's reality, you tell me, and Larry Leichhardt, you can jump in on this too, that crime is up, particularly violent crime done with guns. As a prosecutor, what do you say? What do the statistics say? And Larry, you jump in on this too.
Statistically, it's the opposite. Violent crime peaked in the late 90s, and after 2001, it's come down. It's come down steadily since then. But the perception of crime is up. People think that there's more violent crime than ever. There still is crime, obviously, but people often feel that there's more crime than the statistics actually bear out. And I think the reason for that might be the media. When we look at the media, I often look at the news in the morning and I see there's been a shooting here, there's been a shooting there, there's been a killing there. It might be Somerset County, Indiana County, Beaver County, Allegheny County, but I'm hearing them all in the same broadcast, and when I'm getting dressed in the morning, I'm not differentiating where that is, and I think that happens to many people.
You shake your head when you go into work thinking this is something else you might have to do if it happened in Allegheny
First
County?
thing I want to know is, did you hear where that happened?
Larry?
Yeah, the perception of crime, people do base their perception upon what they hear. They hear and what they read and what they hear. What is interesting about the drop in crime rate is it's worldwide. Crime has essentially been on a decline in the last 10 years. And it's important to understand that we really don't know why. And that's one of the problems with the whole gun violence issue. And we can't even really determine why the overall crime rate drops.
So then how can we consider what legislation should be passed to stop it?
Well, if you don't mind, as you know, I follow all the statistics, and I brought this one of the most recent ones. And the Department of Justice, in a report from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, shows that from 1993 until 2011, violent firearms-related homicides fell 49%. What's more is firearms crime with violence, with violent criminals, with using firearms, fell 69%.
What do you attribute that to?
I attribute that to more effective policing. I attribute that to the concealed carry laws.
Chief Bryant, do you agree? More effective policing has reduced the crime? Concealed carry laws help? People are scared somebody might be packing?
I don't quite agree with everything that he says. More effective policing has helped to reduce the crime. But if you look at who's committing the crimes now, it's younger and younger and younger. Our youth are committing a lot of the violent crime. And the perception is there for the people who live in those communities where the crime is centralized. I mean, it's not like the crime is going down for them.
All right. We'll get into young people and those who are committing the crimes in a second. Let's talk with Michael Bartlett. Michael, what do you have for us?
All right, Chris, thank you so much. You know, this conversation, a lot of things are on the table, and the conversation, believe me, is humming online. At our WQED Facebook page, our Twitter account, go there. Our high-tech guy here at the station, Zach Tanner, he knows what he's doing, believe me. He will get your questions on the air. He will answer your comments, our questions for the panelists. Zach, you have quite a few already.
Yeah, I do, Michael. And Chris, the first question for the panel was kind of a comment about what you guys were just talking about. Judy went to our webpage, the Gun Violence website, and submitted her story, and she talked about how her experiences in the city are limited when she has to try to avoid certain areas of the city, certain neighborhoods in the city. She says that these feelings are really wearing her down, but also spurring her to action. So I think she wants to know if there are other people that are in similar views of that.
Chris?
One of the things we talked about, Mr. McCarthy, is that crime is getting more diffuse, and it may not be just certain neighborhoods that have this crime. Why do you think that is the reality of it?
Well, I think we're talking about the dispersion of crime and displacement. Whenever we increase policing in any given area and to reduce the crime that's occurring there, the people who are committing crime move on. We've had several housing projects in the Hill District that were closed down and torn down, and those people moved to the eastern suburbs. And now there's now an increase in violent crime and drug activity in the areas where they moved to.
Are you saying that people in public housing are more likely to commit crime?
No, that's just the people, some of the people that lived in those particular housing units, because we had shown through the incidence of crime in the Hill District that almost 75% of the crimes, the people that we had arrested for committing crimes lived in those housing projects. And those who were not incarcerated were continuing.
Are these repeat offenders?
Yes, they are.
You make the point, Kim Stouffer, all the time when I talk to you that it's the repeat offenders that need to be incarcerated, and that crime levels would drop considerably if they were to be incarcerated and kept away from all the rest of us who allow law-abiding citizens. Would you make that point, please?
I would make that point. It clearly shows, I've sat in courtrooms where judges had an aversion to mandatory sentencing. And when the firearms laws came up, that was one of the first things he wanted the prosecutor to get rid of. I've sat in a number of court cases where that was the first thing plea bargained away. Take for example, I talk about straw purchase sales. You get a guy, you nail him for selling firearms to a person that doesn't have the ability to legally own one.
Who couldn't pass a background check.
Right. Now, that's a felon. He's going to be in possession of a
firearm. And so what happens to him when he goes to trial?
They never used the 22 years that the seller of the firearm alone could get for selling it. That's already in current law. I helped write sections of that law.
Chief Brian, do you see these people plea bargained away all the time? Mr. McCarthy, the same thing to you? Does police work go unrewarded once you've nabbed one of these ne'er-do-wells and you see a judge give them a tap on the wrist, as Kim asserts?
Everyone has due process. And once it gets beyond the arrest and it goes into the prosecution phase, it depends on what type of case you have. It depends on the individual's past history, what makes the judge, what gives the judge the decision making to either be more lenient or be more stringent on the individual is beyond the police.
And as prosecutors, do you plea bargain this stuff away sometimes?
Rarely.
Because of the case loads that you have?
We rarely make plea bargains on gun cases in Allegheny County. In fact, we have, it's not forbidden, but it can never be done at a line prosecution stage. It has to go up through the senior
Kim, that flies in the face of what you just said.
Well, I can tell you the cases I've watched, and the judges just wipe it away.
Okay, let's go over to the
Bob Nagel case for one.
Let's go over to Tonya Caruso, who has Rob Conroy of Ceasefire with her. Tonya?
That's right. We were talking about how can people at home get involved and get active in their community, and you absolutely have suggestions and information on that.
Oh, sure. I mean, in answer to Judy's query, there are literally hundreds of neighborhood groups throughout the community, and I've been fortunate working in Pittsburgh for Ceasefire to be able to work with so many great community partners. We work together to do the actions, to take action to basically get common sense gun laws and also enforce existing gun laws. And we work on a court watch program in Philadelphia. We're working on getting that here, where we're going to have citizens potentially getting involved to go to sentencing hearings. There are all sorts of ways. I mean, and the key is to basically get together as communities, contact your legislators, and let them know that you would like common sense gun laws. You want your communities to be a safer place.
All right, Reverend Burgess, I'd like to start this portion of it with you. You've hit upon this unique approach of helping the police with the microphones that sense gunshots, the cameras that might record the video. But I wonder how you feel about the legal approaches, also the background checks, the magazines and high capacity assault weapons versus automatic versus semi-automatic, the background checks, all those legal approaches that are being debated on the national level too.
Well, there's really two problems. First of all, let's be honest. There are 300 million guns in the United States. There's no reason that a person in Homewood should have an AK-47 or AR-14 or assault weapon of any sort. Those kind of weaponry, those military weapons have no place in an urban environment. And to say that we do not need stricter gun control laws are ludicrous. It's just the NRA and its puppets who are making a fortune off the publishing of guns.
Forgive me, would you restrict urban gun ownership and not rural gun ownership?
I represent a community where a little child was shot a few days ago. I absolutely restrict guns off the streets if I could. And the real issue is not just guns, it's concentrated poverty. I'm also, as you know, the chair of the Housing Authority. And so when we talk about concentrated poverty, as long as we have hotbeds of poverty where there's low education, lack of jobs, lack of decent housing, you're going to see violence. We have not invested in the urban core. So we need to do investment in the urban core to give people more jobs, more hope, more opportunities, but we also need stricter laws. Absolutely, we need stricter laws. We need to take the guns off the streets as much as we can.
All right, let's go over to Michael Bartley and Zach Tanner.
And we're going to get to Zach in just a moment. I hope this isn't too personal, but this time last week, Thursday night, I'm sitting in my living room in my neighborhood in Greenfield. I'm sure people here saw this on the news. Boom. Boom, boom. A man was shot in the face. He survived. I know that we're going to get into the gun debate here, and we always do. I wonder if people here could talk about the human element here. Now, I know arrest was not made. It hasn't been made public in this case. But I have a lot of elderly neighbors who were shaking on their porches. Shaking. World War II veterans. People who've lived in those homes for 50 years. It's very frightening. And that night, the police are on the scene. The next night is when the people are tossing and turning in their beds, and they're still scared. There's a human element, and for families that are directly impacted by it. And I'm just a guy in my living room watching TV, but there's great fear when this happens. What do we have to say about that in terms of, you know, it goes beyond families, it goes to a whole neighborhood when somebody recklessly pulls this trigger?
I have something to say.
Sure.
You brought up an issue that's intertwined with a number of issues. First of all, when we don't deal with the criminal, and I'm willing to bet that person who pulled that trigger had a long waiting list of crimes he could be prosecuted for, already had been, and instead was reduced. I mean, when you take something you could get 18, 20 years, and you roll it back, and they end up serving 3, what does that tell a criminal? Now, I want to put this in the most friendly terms as I can, but I want people to think about this. I want everybody to think about this. What happens when we leave here tonight and we continue the simplistic notion that gun control is going to work or do anything? We have 145 pages of state laws alone, and yet they do nothing about the fact that they don't apply them.
How do we get a message? How do we get a message to the guy that pulled that trigger?
Keep him
that
in jail.
People are affected by this.
Keep
I'm not
him in-
asking about gun control. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes,
You're on the
yes.
streets every day.
I
You
know
see
what you're-
people shaking. I don't care what neighborhood it is.
I know what you're talking about. When someone is shot and killed in the street, it doesn't just affect the person who's dead. It affects the whole family. It affects the whole community. And when you talk about the people who heard that gunshot, how frightened they are.
It's ringing
the next
in their
day,
head. It's
the
ringing
next
in their
week,
head.
It just generates. There should be stricter gun laws. There's no such thing as someone is locked up and you throw away the key and that's what we need to do. That doesn't work. There are people sitting on death row, life sentences. You know, that hasn't deterred it. We have to start young. We have to talk to our young people. You know, we have to change the culture so that when you turn 21, the first thing you want to do is go out and buy a gun and tell somebody you're legal. You know, we have to change the mindset of our young people so they don't want to pick up a gun.
Mr. McCarthy, you talk about young people and people you have convicted who are young, and they seem to have no fear of the prison sentence that they're given or the time that they're going to do. Can you relate what you had told me earlier about that?
Yeah, oftentimes it's the case when a young person, 18, 19, 20, now treated as an adult, not as a juvenile offender, comes in for sentencing after committing a violent crime, and they are sentenced to 5, 10, 15 years, and they don't show any emotion. They've been so desensitized to the punishment that they don't care.
What accounts for that?
Sometimes it's fatalism, that they've grown up in a lower socioeconomic neighborhood. They see no chance for a future. They think that they live for today, and they don't expect to live till next year. So why do they worry about this? And when they face the idea of going to prison, they think, well, I'll serve my time and I'll start over when I get out.
What about people, Reverend Burgess, who don't see anything? You talked about the 1-year-old, the 18-month or 19-month-year-old who got 19-month-old who got killed, the 2 women who were shot in East Hills in your district. It was at a barbecue. There were hundreds of people there. What did they tell the police?
Well, I mean, I've had a chance to talk with the girls and see them in the hospital, talk to the mother and grandmother, and was at the funeral and chatted with the family. The problem we have is that there is an undercurrent of young people who we have forgotten about for generations, and we have not invested in them. The truth of it is we have to invest in lower moderate income communities. We have to make them safe. We have to give these young people an opportunity to get out of their communities, to see that there's something bigger than where they're living, to give them an opportunity to be gainfully employed. Unfortunately, they're living in environments where all they see is despair. If you're hearing gunshots in your neighborhood every night, if you're seeing your little sisters being put in bathtubs, having to have your children play in the basement, they're living in places and it's concentrated poverty. And that's the dirty secret no one wants to talk about. We have taken very poor people, most of them African American in Pittsburgh, and we have forced them to live in very isolated, very dangerous communities. And until we are able to either change their environment, which we're trying to do, at least on the Housing Authority side, we're trying to change that into mixed neighborhoods like Garfield, mixed income neighborhoods. Until you change the nature of their community, you're going to still have generation after generation after generation of hopelessness and helplessness, and that breeds drug addiction and violence.
Let's go to Tonya Caruso. Tonya?
Chris, I'm here now with Adrienne Young, and Mrs. Young, your story really became known to so many Pittsburghers for such a tragic reason. The loss of your son, innocent bystander, promising art student at CMU, and you have been active ever since.
Yes, I have. I felt the devastation personally. I've watched my community become fragmented. And what I'm here today, I would like to ask Maurita Bryant or others. I have a database with over 200 mothers who have no idea who killed their children. I get calls from them constantly. They tell me that when they call the detectives, that the detectives tell them that they just don't have any information. What can we do to help these mothers to find out who killed their children? I believe they're just as important as anyone else. And it appears that we've become lost somehow, and they don't even bother to try to find out who have committed these murders.
When you have mothers like that, support groups like what you have, that's the best thing you can do to help them. But it's not that their cases are not worked or forgotten. They can always call the homicide office and speak to a supervisor or the detectives on the case. What happens is so often we know who the shooters are. We know who the shooters are, but we don't have enough to bring that case to court to be prosecuted. The last thing that we ever want to do is take a weak case to court and the perpetrator gets off because we don't have enough evidence. And what's lacking a lot of times is someone who's willing to come forward and testify. And in some cases, those who are able to testify are so ingrained in the criminal activity themselves that they don't make good witnesses. You have a jury, they don't believe them because they have as much baggage as the perpetrator. So there's a whole lot of elements why some of the cases are not solved. It's not because we don't care or we're not trying, it's because we don't have enough to bring that case to court.
Michael Bartley has another studio audience question.
Chris, thanks so much. And I was mentioning hearing those gunshots in my neighborhood last week, and Pastor Walter Evans says You hear gunshots every day?
Yes, yes. It's to the point you hear gunshots, you actually think they firecrackers. But if you have spent time around firearms, I've been in the military, you know the difference between a firecracker and firearms. But I would like to make a comment to what Councilman Burgess said. I was a youth pastor for 11 years, 5 on the Hill, 6 in East Liberty. And the age of the criminal is so young now to have the approach to throw them in jail. Eventually they're gonna get out. Our society doesn't have a change policy, which is what we need. You need a policy that will give a person a second chance. You commit a crime, a felony when you're 18 and you're 35 and you apply for a job and you still had the same outcome as that you're a convicted felon. Well, if you don't expect that person to change, if you're not going to change, that person's not going to change.
So recidivism is
right. He's going to revert back to what he know, what he's familiar, because after all, it is survival. And to what Councilman Burgess said, the economic issue here, it's astronomical when it comes to young Afro-American males. It's what I call mental terrorism. It tears, they know that between the ages of 16 and 25, I'm probably going to get shot before I go to college. If I go to college, am I going to make it out the neighborhood I live in? When you're dealing with that type of mentality around you all the time, you have to try to find an escape. And most of these young guys out here don't have an escape. So the drug use, and I have 5 children myself. My 21-year-old daughter, I asked her why she's always sitting in the house, and this come out of her mouth, that everyone who tries to talk to me, they're either popping pills or they're smoking weed. She's 21 years old, and that's her perception of what's around her. I mean, the bottom line is the lawmakers have to change their mentality in order for these people to change their mentality. Because if you don't, you're going to keep getting the same. You can lock them up. You can say lock them up and throw away the key. But when you spend $42,000 to incarcerate someone and won't spend $6,000 to give them a semester over CCAC, and then you ask yourself why the system is the way it is, you need to blame yourself.
Reverend, that also brings up a point for your daughter and many other black marriageable aged women that they can't find, and I get these calls all the time, where are the fathers, where are the dads? They can't find an eligible mate to raise a family.
Well, you know, I often ask myself, why was I a youth pastor? I now pastor men. And when I see the men who don't know how to be fathers and raise the children that they do have, don't have any connection or relationship with them. And like you said, we convict more people in this country than any other country. To date, there's probably 1.5 million Afro-American males in the penal system. We don't have a third of that in college. I mean, with these statistics, Pittsburgh is kind of moderate, but Chicago, 500 plus murders in 1 year, and it never make the national news until the president who's from Chicago becomes president. So now it makes the national news. I heard this from a reporter when the young girl, when the shooting at Peabody High School. She told me it's true. If the story bleeds, it leads. Stop reporting the mess and start uplifting the people, and you will get change.
But aren't you talking about parental responsibility, you believe, is an important issue here?
Absolutely. But then when you have a society who does not know, we're dealing with the 3rd generation crack baby, who, like he said, is desensitized. They don't have, if you think going to jail scares them, it don't. If it did, we wouldn't have the statistics we have now. So at the end of the day, putting them in jail is not a deterrent. If it was a deterrent, we wouldn't have the crime we have now.
Well, Kim, that's your attitude, though. You say lock away to repeat offenders and that would stop it. He says it doesn't. We incarcerate more people in America than any other country.
Well, it's the doctrine of competing harms. You have the possibility of going to jail, or you want leniency for shooting someone. The moment they pick up a gun, they're picking up death. And unless we realize that, and that they're going, and when they put them out of the justice system, when they turn them loose, then we have a real problem. because we got a person that's not accountable to society, hasn't been properly addressed through his youth all the way up, and now what? We're going to be looking at this as a surprise because he all of a sudden shot someone, or he shot someone again and was let go leniently because he was a juvenile?
All right, let's go over to Peter Georgiades, who's with Tonya Caruso. He's a certified firearms instructor and an expert in firearms law.
Right, and you bring a unique perspective from all sides to this issue.
Well, listening to particularly the Reverend's talk, there's an old phrase that isn't very popular anymore: no justice, no peace. Now, where are you going to make a societal, a policy solution out of that phrase, which I believe to be true? We've talked a lot about the people who are injured and frightened in the neighborhoods, and we've talked about, at least with respect to inner city violence, how it comes about. But you know, I've trained 10,000 people in my life. Every one of them came to me because they were afraid. And every one of them had the right to defend himself or herself. And I don't know a one of them that was a criminal. For one thing, we do background checks before we train people. We're losing track of the millions of Americans who want to exercise their constitutional right to be armed so they don't have to be afraid the day after the shooting. That's a big part of this picture that every conversation I get into, it quickly evaporates. We don't talk about the 6 people we saw on the clip there. Wives, husbands, homeowners, just ordinary people who don't want to be afraid anymore.
And so, Peter, do you think then that these people are arming themselves and they are the law-abiding citizens, and that they, if we passed any of this legislation we've talked about tonight, then they just won't, they'll be affected and their lives will be harmed, their security will be harmed?
Well, 3 questions. Of course they'll be affected. You've changed the law, and all of these people who are law-abiding will follow the law by definition, except those who say, I've had enough. When guns are outlawed, I'll become an outlaw. And there are many of those. That's an increasing percentage of the people I see. They say, I've had enough. Ban what you want. I am not going to live my life in fear because this guy or that guy has a hunch that if I'm disarmed, it will be better. None of my students are criminals. None of my students are mentally ill such that they are dangerous, and most mentally ill people are not dangerous. But you're talking about restricting their rights. All we insist upon is if you're going to do that, you better know what you're talking about.
And you maintain that most people don't know what they're talking about now who are going to pass the laws?
They're guessing.
Okay.
Okay, but you did say in the documentary that you do not think it's irrational to have background checks, correct?
Well, that's not irrational. I didn't say it would work. First of all, hardened criminals are going to get their guns illegally, and do. And the lunatics who've carried out mass shootings, a guy who dresses up like a Batman character and walks into a movie theater, the background checks, which of those crimes, and anybody can tell me, which one of those crimes would have been prevented by universal background checks?
But Canada and England and European nations that have much stricter laws concerning firearms are much safer. They have a much lower incidence of homicides by firearms. So we absolutely know that if you take guns out of people's hands, you will reduce homicides. Plus, in the communities I represent, none of the people that you've trained would prevent the deaths that are occurring. People are being shot indiscriminately, walking down the street, being on cookouts, and whether they're armed or not, they'll still get shot. I mean, this idea.
You're right about that.
I know I'm right about that because I see it every day. And so,
I never
therefore,
suggested that these people being trained would help your folks not get shot.
One at a time, excuse me, let the Reverend finish,
If you
please.
limit guns, absolutely you reduce the homicide rate. If you limit guns. I'm not saying guns is the only answer. Limiting guns is one solution. I've suggested other solutions such as cameras, such as shot spotters, such as the Pittsburgh Initiative to Reduce Crime, which is a deterrent approach to reducing gun violence, and such as reducing poverty, reducing undereducation. There's a variety of things. All of them cost investing resources into low and moderate income communities disproportionately.
Peter?
I agree with almost everything you've said, and I respect your point of view. I don't know you, but obviously you've thought about this. But the fact of the matter is that the violent crime rate in England has increased dramatically in recent years. And in Canada, there's an interesting thing about passing too many laws, especially laws you can't enforce. It fosters disrespect for the law. I mean, the only thing between us and real chaos is the law. If you don't respect that law, if people figure, forget it, you're creating a monster. And in Canada, absolute civil disobedience in the sense of just disobeying the law is rampant on this issue.
All right, let's go to Michael Bartley.
All right, Dr. Sharma Dudley is a psychologist who deals a lot with this. Dr. Dudley.
Hi. I wasn't planning on coming up here today, but this gun violence is really affects all of us. And I really think it really affects the mental health of children and adolescents. So when you talked about your experience that evening in Greenfield, I saw that on the news as well. And I think what people don't realize, as Reverend Burgess is saying, in a lot of our communities, in African American communities, kids are exposed to violence day in and day out.
There were 2 children upstairs when this happened.
Okay.
Little kids, 5 and 3.
And when they're exposed to something like this, they can experience symptoms similar to post-traumatic stress disorder. So in some of these communities where children day in and day out are walking home from school, they can't be on the baseball field because someone is taking a shot at them, or a parent or someone. That can affect them emotionally and behaviorally. And when that occurs, you're going to see significant symptoms of depression and anxiety. But it took Sandy Hook, and that was a tragic event. But those same type of events are occurring every day in Pittsburgh.
Yes.
And I think that we all need to think about that and the effect that it has. Chris Michaels, who just talked about, mental health funding has been cut. Where is the money going? Children and families need services, not just social service, but they need mental health services as well. So I just wanted to make that point this evening.
It's amazing what the kids see.
All right, Larry Leicar, I don't know if you wanted to jump in where Peter was talking.
Yes, let's understand about, go back on the gun regulation aspect. We had the 2 major Supreme Court decisions, and they were based on in D.C. and in Chicago. And the reason the Supreme Court they took those cases, and they took them because those cities had they had very high crime rates, and the laws were extremely restrictive. I mean, you could not own a handgun, and the court looked at that and decided, well, for one, it certainly was not a solution, and secondly, you had a great many citizens who wanted the protection of a handgun. And if you look at those decisions also, the court never said you can't have regulations on firearms. The idea of background checks, I think, is a given. That's the interest of the U.S. government, both state and the U.S. and the state governments, is to ensure that the people who have any type of instrumentality that's dangerous, there should be some type of check so certain people can have them.
Yeah,
the
but
court
some
was
people
fine with
say
that.
that's the first step in keeping a list of arms, and then confiscation would be next.
The court determines the Second Amendment, actually. It's the Supreme Court that interprets it. And they were very emphatic about the idea that you can have some regulations, but those regulations have to be, they basically have to be a compelling need of the state, and they have to be subjected to the strictest scrutiny. So you can regulate firearms, but and in fact, the court threw out some examples of regulations, including unusual weapons, the fact that anybody who's convicted felon should not get weapons. The court actually said background checks. It didn't say in exactly those words, but when the decision is very clear that background checks are totally within the bounds of the Second Amendment. So I see that as something that, and yes, it does sometimes stop these issues. They catch a lot of people through background checks who are felons, and they get caught at that issue. So it does have some effect.
Let's go over to Tonya.
Chris, we're here now with Richard Garland, and he has worked with young people in our community for more than a decade now.
Hi, I currently work at the University of Pittsburgh School of Public Health, and this conversation is really frustrating to me when we talk about, especially the folks that we really talking about is young African American males. When we start talking about urban communities, both in the city and county, this is where the violence is happening. When you say lock them up and throw away the key, I can tell you right now that most of these guys, when they do come home, you talked about the early 90s, some of them guys are coming home. They've taken education out of the prison system. These guys come home without any skills. So how, you know, what are we doing? What are we doing as a community to do something with, when we talk about rehabilitation? Is there really rehabilitation? What are we going to do to help these guys be productive in society once they've served their time? We really need to start doing something about that. I mean, and the violence that we're seeing in the streets right now, they're getting younger. They are babies. They are babies. They have no knowledge of what they're doing. Talk about mental health, drug and alcohol, the drugs that they're taking today. I mean, it doesn't just affect the African American community, it affects the white community too. We see more Sandy Hooks, different places like that, and it's because of some of the drugs that they're using. I attended a thing last night, the war on drugs, but it really didn't come up with no concrete answers. We as a community had to really start coming together to address this problem. I mean, the district attorney's office, the police, we work with everybody.
You mind me making a point? We have a lot of esteemed people up here, people I respect greatly. But when it comes down to the basics, we began Firearms Owners Against Crime because we felt that many leaders, political and some agencies, were demagoguing this issue. Instead of focusing on gun control, which we know is divisive, why aren't we forming community groups, going to the legislators and demanding laws and changes in laws that allow us to keep our young people focused? Because I'm going to tell you what, I've been to the legislator's office I don't know how many thousands of times. And there's probably legislators in this room that could attest to that. At the local, the county, the state, and the federal offices. I go to DC. I don't get paid for that. How much good could you do by putting together mothers and fathers and children like that and walk in the offices and demand? It may take 2 to 3 years.
I am not racist, but when it comes to the African American community, we're left out of it. I could tell you right now, the easiest thing for a kid in the African American community to get is a gun. Okay, that's the easiest thing. When you talk this whole thing about gun control, that's not an issue. I mean, every other kid, the easiest thing to get in our community is a gun. You know what I mean? And that's not because the police aren't doing their job.
So are you essentially saying the focus should not be on gun laws? We should just be investing in the community and working on social programs to try to bring, if you had to pick a priority.
No question about it. There's money, all these programs, different programs have been cut because of funding. There's a lot of folks that's doing really good work with younger population. I mean, and we do need to concentrate on that population because those are the younger ones that, jail isn't a deterrent because what they're living in right now is jail. That's right.
Councilman Burgess, excuse me, you've made the same proposal. We're short on time, but that's the kind of thing that you're talking about, and that's why you're taking these approaches for jobs, other kinds of programs, cameras, and not focusing on laws and passing laws against gun control. Is that correctly?
That's exactly right.
Okay. All right, let's go over to Michael Bartlett.
All right, thanks so much, Chris, because I don't want to leave Joe Dom out of this conversation. He is the uncle of Michael and Nancy Schaub. Let me give you some background. The name may be familiar. Michael Schaub was on his lunch hour. Came back to Western Psych. He was a therapist there. The family was part of our first documentary on gun violence, part of the victims, and their parents went on camera for the first time about this case. Michael was gunned down by a person we're told was mentally ill. His sister, Nancy, was killed by her boyfriend, a victim of gun violence, 1 year before that. Both of their kids, both of your sister's kids, are gone.
Yes, that's exactly right. both these people, these murderers of my niece and nephew, should not have had guns. One was on probation, the other one was mentally ill. Under Pennsylvania state law, he should not have had a weapon, but he went out of state to get a weapon by internet from some other state that doesn't have strong regulations. So, you know, and that's one thing I think we all share in this as victims, you know, what our race is doesn't matter, is that most of these crimes committed by people who should not have weapons. And I think the political, not the political will, but the people's will is 90% of us don't want weapons to be in the wrong hands. And why can't something be done? And I'm very frustrated as a father. I'm very frustrated as an uncle, and as a citizen, I'm very frustrated with this.
We hear you.
Why can't, you know, we get the low-hanging fruit out of the way? Background checks, cut the supply of illegal weapons and ammunition to the streets. I mean, there's a fire. You know, you talk about like, the streets being a fire. What do you do to a fire? You cut off the oxygen. So we should do what the councilman's recommended. You know, cut off the supply.
I know we're short on time.
Kim Stover, that sounds like a very even-headed request. Do you reject what he just said? A man who has suffered so much?
Well, I really feel bad for your suffering. And I'm not saying in any way, shape, or form, if I could alleviate your suffering, I'd take all my firearms now and give them in to the government. But the fact is, that won't happen because I'm a responsible owner. And like Mr. Georgiadis talked about, he's trained 10,000 people. I've trained 5,000.
Kim, let me interrupt you because what Commander Bryant, I'm sorry, Assistant Chief Bryant was saying about irresponsible.
There's so many irresponsible gun owners who legally have guns, but they don't secure them. They leave them in their cars. They leave them in their homes unsecure. Those are the guns that get on the street, especially in Pittsburgh. We don't have a gun store in the city of Pittsburgh. They're irresponsible gun owners who've legally purchased and collect guns. That's how the guns get in the hands of the people in your community.
And is there anything legislatively quickly that can be done to stop that?
There is, but there's not currently. You don't have to necessarily report a gun that's lost.
All right, I have to cut you off. This is the end of our televised portion of the program, but there's more discussion that's going to happen online, as Michael and Tonya can explain right now.
All right, Chris, thank you so much, and thanks to our panel and our live audience here in the studio. And you can watch this forum, both WQED documentaries and our web series of personal stories from people impacted by gun violence anytime online at wqed.org/gunviolence.
And as we said, this discussion isn't over. Our panel is staying with us for an exclusive online conversation as this forum continues on wqed.org.
And our Zach Tanner will continue monitoring your comments through social media.
So if you're not already watching online, log on to wqed.org and stay with us.
Thanks for taking part.
We're going to continue our conversation online now. Reverend Burgess, when we talk about the young people who are involved in this kind of crime, we just heard Richard Garland talking about this. How do we reach out to these young people? You're in the community every day. You go to these funerals. Your heart must break for these young people because we end up burying one and then incarcerating the other. How will we reach these young people who have been so hardened or addled by drugs?
Well, you know, I've spent a lot of my time trying to design youth programming, even working in the jails. you need a four-pronged approach. You need prevention programs, you need intervention programs, you need prosecution programs, and you need reintegration programs. All four of them have to be fully funded and have to be ingrained in the community so that we're working with an integrated approach. So that as we reach the kids in grade school, we're also having sports teams, we're also reaching them in churches, we're also helping their families. It has to take a systems approach because we can't just reach the kids without doing the things that are necessary to educate their fathers, which is necessary to get their mothers off drugs. You have in low and moderate income communities a system of family that has been broken in many ways, and we have to rebuild it. And so you can't just help the kid in isolation, you have to rebuild the family structure and provide all sorts of wraparound services and programs. The problem is all of these things cost money, number one. And number two, as Richard's right, there's a difference between the reaction of when a suburban non-African American child is killed and when an African American or Latino child is killed in a lower moderate income communities. Our children are being killed every day. It's not making the national news. It gets sometimes the headlines.
Sir, we just saw the grief of an uncle who lost his. What do you think accounts for that difference that you perceive?
Well, because unfortunately, their pain is, although real, is isolated and not every day. For the most part, there's not shootings going on in Fox Chapel. For the most part, there's not shootings in Mount Lebanon. But in Homewood, Brushton, in Lincoln, Leamington, and Lawmer, I have shootings every week. I have shootings every day. I have homicides sometimes every week. It's a difference in the amount of violence, in the amount of gunfire, and in the destruction in those communities. And there has not been the political will to invest the type of dollars needed to rebuild those communities, and we still have barriers where low and moderate income communities can't live in other places. They have no equity in their homes, so they can't necessarily even keep their houses up. Even if they're in their houses and homeowners, they're trapped. The system is not necessarily is designed, but the system that we have, unfortunately, terrorizes low and moderate income people, and they're trapped into a cycle of hopelessness and helplessness, which leads to drug addiction and violence.
Let's go to Tonya.
Chris, we're here with Dr. Carl Williams, the medical examiner of Allegheny County.
Thank you, Tanya. I have a couple of quick comments. One is, as tragic as the homicide deaths are in the black community, highest per capita in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, one of the highest in the county, 80% of all of the homicides that come into my office. Nobody has yet mentioned the fact that the suicides, many of them gun-related, are 1.5 times what the homicides are. The accidents related to guns are also extraordinarily high. It needs to focus, and Executive Fitzgerald has just started a new panel that I think is going to have some effect in the community. And at the initial discussions of that, the point was not mental health. There's a stigma attached to mental health. We discussed at the first meeting. It's community mental health. It's accessing all of the resources to make stronger communities that we've talked about. But this experiment's been done. I mean, if 20 years ago they looked at the difference in all incidents of gun-related violence between Seattle and Vancouver across the border, okay? Very similar demographic, very similar in terms of the racial, Latinos replaced by Asian community, very similar communities. The only difference being a line related to gun control. Everything is lower in Vancouver. Homicides, suicides, accidental deaths. There's just no doubt that this experiment's been done, and we're going to see it again as the gun laws change community by community in the United States. We're going to see what the effect is of gun control laws. But there's just no doubt, and I guess you could think of the absurd extreme. If there were no guns in the community, nobody'd have to worry about arming themselves. I mean, come on, 300 million guns, more guns than the entire military has. Too many guns.
All right, let's go over to Michael Bartlett. Michael?
Okay, we have a county commissioner from Washington County, Diana Irie Vaughn.
Hi. I just wanted to offer a little bit of a different perspective. First, in Washington County, we started a program 18 years ago, and it's called FITS, Furlough into Service, and we take our nonviolent offenders when they first come into the correctional facility, and we place them in jobs in the community. So when they come out of the correctional facility, a lot of them keep those jobs. So we have businesses that are cooperating, and that's our way to reach out to people to try to give them hope for the future. Second, I wanted to talk to you about, in Washington County, we had more deaths last year from falls than from gunshot wounds. We had more deaths last year from drug overdoses than we did gunshot wounds. So our county is a little bit different. From my perspective, I'm a very small statured woman, 100 pounds. I've been a single mother, caring for my children. I've been stalked. My children have been followed. My home was broken into. How can I protect myself and my family? What weapon would I use to protect them? I had an incident where my security alarm went off at 3 in the morning. I don't have local police protection. It took the state police 20 minutes to get to my home. 20 minutes was good, but in that length of time, what could have happened? So I choose to arm myself to protect my family. If I had to use a different type of weapon other than a firearm, and I had to be close to the attacker, the person to assault me, they would quickly overpower me. So I just wanted to offer my perspective. So thank you all so much for being here and commenting and standing up for your beliefs.
But before you go, a main part of this conversation is this what did you call it, Ricky, the cycle of pain, okay? Yeah. And the pastor who was here from Mount Arad was talking about the guys got out of jail, nobody helps them. How did you get the employers to do this? Tell us a little bit more about this.
We just started offering the program up. When we first started FITS, it was really putting people in the community, the nonviolent offenders. We had them working for nonprofits, local governments, and people saw that when they came in initially and they weren't violent, that they were okay in the community. So the weekenders and work release, we have community service through the courts, and they've put them together. Excuse me, and as we've been growing in population, we've had businesses we've reached out to, and they've accepted our inmates, and they will bring, we have several that come from the Mon Valley manufacturers. They actually bring transportation vans to pick up the inmates, and then they bring them back at the end of the day.
Okay, Commissioner, thanks so much. Get the guys to work.
All right, let's go to Tonya Caruso, who is the mayor of Aliquippa with.
DeJuan Walker.
I was agreeing with Councilman Burgess about generational curses about the city. I'm from Aliquippa, Pennsylvania. I too was touched by gun violence. My sister was murdered on September 5th of 2009. She's the reason why she sparked the flame for me becoming mayor, to change the atmosphere of my city, to look at it differently from not just a political standpoint, but a citizen standpoint. But there are generational curses in the city of Aliquippa, and the resources that you talk about, we don't have. We used to have an AUD, or Franklin Center, was a cornerstone of what Aliquippa could do to reach out to people with nonviolent or violent crimes. We don't have that atmosphere anymore. Me as being a new mayor, like I said, I've only been in office for 18 months, but I am trying to look at avenues to bring those resources to the city of Aliquippa and Beaver County, because we don't have that. 51% of my population, or the Beaver County population, was born and raised in my city. But yet my city has suffered. The mill was there, the people moved out, drugs and things moved in, but then the resources dwindled. So what can I mean, just not Pennsylvania, but what can Western Pennsylvania do to uplift the city of Aliquippa? Because again, 51% of the population was built off our back. The steel mills produced 36,000 people that lived and worked in that city. But yet we have suffered, and we continue to suffer with the lack of resources, the generational curses, the avenues to get the resources to fix these people. So that is my question. I mean, Mr. Burgess, I agree with you 150% about what you're saying about those curses and how you can try to manipulate and change those things, but it's tough in a city like mine that does lack the lack of resources.
So would you rather have more resources or tougher gun laws?
I would like to have 50-50. I mean, I would like to have the resources. I would like to have the resources to get the curb the enthusiasm for gun violence, but I also would like to have the laws to be stricter, again, because the gentleman that shot my sister should not have had a gun. He was 302, he got a gun, and he shot my sister in front of my nephew. You know, 8 hours before she died, I was standing right there talking to her. So believe me, I would like to have 50-50.
Larry Leichhardt.
Chris, one thing when we start looking at social programs and crime, when we were very, very active in social programs in the 90s, we didn't see, well, actually in the late 80s, into the 80s, into the early 90s, the crime rates really peaked in the 80s and around 1991, 1992. Even though we've seen a great reduction in social programs, it's from the 2000 on, even though we've seen that reduction, our crime rates continue to go down. It's very hard to link social programs with crime rates.
That's what the evidence, statistical evidence, indicates to you.
Well, it just says again that when it comes to violence, specifically very violent crimes, including with guns, facilitated violence, we just really don't have an answer.
So are then Councilman Burgess and Mayor Walker wrong when they want more social programs and more jobs for people?
No, they're not wrong. I'm just saying that right now we can't actually point to the programs that we've utilized in many of these areas to try to reduce violence and actually show observable results. And part of that problem is that funding for research into a variety of these programs and initiatives. That's very involved research. It costs a lot of money, and there's often very tough to get funding.
But Larry, there are people who have a palpable fear. We've talked about it. There are people who want something done, and you crunch the numbers as well as anyone. What has been shown to work? Is it gun control laws, social programs? What reduces crime? What stops ne'er-do-wells from killing one another?
Well, again, crime has went down, except crime is very localized in its nature. So we see pockets, we see cities, certain pockets in the cities, even actually states. You'll see dramatic differences.
But my question is, what works?
We
sir?
haven't been able to find anything that definitively works.
Is that why no legislation can get passed
lack
in the
of
National
lack
Congress?
of funding, but this is something the U.S. government has to fund a lot more heavily, and it's very, very tough for the U.S. government to fund that. Research into this whole area of gun-related violence. You mentioned gun-related violence. That's not going to go past the U.S. House of Representatives.
All right, let's go over to Michael Bartlett. Michael?
Okay, Chris, we want to get, I know the viewers are really trying to get on this conversation as well. And Zach, you have a comment.
Yeah, we have a comment from Grant on Facebook, and it's what you guys were just talking about. He says that the problem isn't necessarily how people are getting guns, but why they're using them. And that's what his big focus is.
And that's so true. You need those social programs, but you need good quality programs that really address the problems. To why young people want to pick up a gun. Why do they feel that that's their only answer? I don't believe that to reduce the fear of people, that everybody straps on a gun and everything will be fine. Because it's like taking us back to the Wild Wild West.
Kim believes that if we all strap on guns, it'll be fine.
That's not the society that we want to live in.
I believe everybody has a choice. That's what the Second
But
Amendment is.
you have pointed to studies and waved them in my face before, telling me that in states where they have concealed carry laws, that crime goes down, and it's because of that. You've told me that.
That's absolutely true. That's absolutely
Well, that's what I
true.
meant by you believe that if
I don't
everybody
believe
had a gun.
everybody should carry, because you've got a range of people that have physical infirmities. I could go on for probably 20 minutes. But the issue here is that no one has a right to take these people's Second Amendment or none of these.
Okay.
You either have freedom or you don't.
Let's go to the prosecutor here. You want to jump in here?
Chris, I think we're painting with too broad of a brush here. When we talked about victimization, I think what's often overlooked is poor people are more often the victims of crime than any other demographic.
Yes.
And that's what we have to understand. When you live in a poor neighborhood, you are, as we mentioned before, the fear, and it is an uncalculated cost of crime, the fear that people live with every day and how that affects them. We've already mentioned the fact that the children growing up in these areas are desensitized to many factors. And so, as the chief mentions, dealing with children and raising them well in these areas is the biggest obstacle we have and our greatest challenge. And that's where, if we're going to reduce crime and criminality, that's where it is.
Does that start with the family then? We keep talking about, Ms. Bryant, you mentioned programs. What about fathers? What about mothers? What about those kind of programs that we used to have for people in my generation?
I've always felt that a lot of our problems are caused because there's dysfunctional homes. And it is generational. It is generational. You have to start here in pre-K, teaching kids about being respectful, about other people's property. You have to start, to me, with the young people, and they can take it into the house, but you have to deal with the whole family. And in order to deal with the whole family, you have to have the resources.
I want to get to Michael Bartlett, but I can see Reverend Burgess is championing.
The other thing that we don't like to talk about is we have become more and more economically and racially stratified. and less diverse. I mean, I grew up in Homewood since 1957. I went to an Irish and Italian neighborhood, to a middle class black neighborhood, to a poor community. And what we have is we have urban centers that are disproportionately poor, disproportionately brown and black, and that's poor, and that's where the homicides are occurring. And there is really no concerted effort to change that. In fact, just the opposite. In Pittsburgh, we're building more and more suburban communities further and further out, where there's almost no African American populations living there. Poor African Americans are stuck in inner cities, in places where there is very little jobs, there's little access to transportation, and they're undereducated and very poor, and that's who's shooting each other.
What would you say to anyone who says that's that community's fault and that's why we moved away in the first place?
Well,
you can grunt if you want to. I take calls from people who tell me that every day.
Well, what we have to do, though, is we have to give them opportunities to be successful. We have to build diverse communities that are economically diverse. We cannot allow any community to become concentrated poor, because when that happens, the business community will leave, the middle class will leave, and all that's left is hopelessness, helplessness, drug addiction, violence, and incarceration.
I see nodding heads around the table, but let's go over here to Michael Bartley. Yes.
Okay, Deborah Germany needs no introduction. Her son Raymond was murdered. She didn't sit on the couch, she took action. You have lots to say here tonight.
Well, we currently have our program in Renewal, Inc. We were approached by Steve Devlin to bring a spiritual-based program into Renewal. We're in 5 different divisions, helping the men when they get out. But it's so unfortunate that there's not a lot in our communities. These men that want to turn their lives around, they've done their time, they have nothing. It's like we're putting a Band-Aid on something that needs surgery. And as a service provider, a lot of our funding has been cut. The majority of our program is run out of pocket because there's nothing in our communities. They come in our communities, they build high rises with development, but when are they going to invest in human lives? What about a workforce development, half housing, half transitional? But they build high rises with luxury apartments. When are we going to start investing in human lives? And a lot of the men that are in prison, because I'm in prisons all the time, a lot of the equipment and training that's in there is outdated. It's outdated. It doesn't match the technology that they meet when they come out. So I just want to know, when are we going to start investing in their lives? Because we can't afford not to, because you're going to wake up and they're going to be standing in your bedroom. You better invest in them, honestly, because they will be literally standing in your bedroom, and desperate people do desperate things.
Councilman Burgess, that's the kind of thing that you're talking about, isn't it?
That's exactly right. If we do not change the whole structure of what we value, you know, the state legislature has given incentives to build roads in the suburban communities away from the urban core, and we've seen the flight of the middle class. And what we have left in certain parts of the city of Pittsburgh is concentrated poverty, mostly people of color, in absolute abysmal conditions. That has to be changed, and it can be changed, but it takes investment in the urban core.
Let's go to Tonya Caruso.
Chris, I have with me now Mary Jo Harwood from the Center for Victims, and your organization really is on the front line when it comes to victim services. Oftentimes, that's the first call a family makes after a tragedy.
That's correct, and I'm hearing a lot of conversation that is fear-based this evening, as well as conversation that I definitely agree with, and we see constantly in terms of our African American youth need hope. There's an awful lot of despair and helplessness, and what our clients tell us, we see approximately 17,000 clients a year. About 20% of those are impacted by gun violence, and they talk about their lives being shattered. And when those lives are shattered, there's a great deal of fear. And when we work with the youth in Homestead and in East Liberty, and after all of these incidences of shooting, the youth talk about how angry they are and how they feel like the only recourse they have is to seek retaliation. And so part of what the solution is, we believe at the center, is to teach kids alternatives to pulling out a gun because they're afraid and because they've been exposed to it day in and day out, teaching them conflict resolution skills, teaching them job training skills, hooking them up with resources in the community that give them hope and opportunity, and putting those lives back together by when they get anxious and they get fearful, as the one lady talked about, the fact that there's a higher degree of depression and anxiety due to that chronic exposure. What do we do to honor that with these children? What do we do to validate that and to say there's a constant cycle? You give into the anxiety, you give into the fear, and you pick up a gun, and then the cycle just continues to be perpetuated. And instead, to acknowledge that unaddressed and unresolved trauma. And what our staff does is we're very well knowledgeable about trauma, and we teach them about the impact of trauma so that they can make a better decision. They're not aware, they don't connect the dots that I was once a victim and I'm angry and nobody took care of me. Therefore, I'm going to lash out at other people, and it dictates all their subsequent decisions that they make, and they wind up in detention centers and then in jail. So a big part of it is to not feed the fear, but teach them how to cope with that so they can break that cycle of violence.
All right, Michael Bartley.
Chris, thank you. Minister Jacqueline McCroman of Oakland.
Yes, I would just like to make a comment with the Word of God on the situation. And the Word of God said, "Thus saith the Lord of hosts, consider and call for the mourning woman, that they may come, and send for the skillful wailing women, that they may come. Let them make haste and take up a wailing for us, that our eyes may run with tears, and our eyelids gush with water. For a voice of wailing is heard from Zion. How we are plundered, we are greatly ashamed, because we have forsaken the land, because we have been cast out of our dwellings. Yet hear the word of the Lord, O woman, and let your ear receive the word of his mouth. Teach your daughters to wail, and every her neighbor a lamentation. For death has come through our windows, and has entered our palaces, to kill off our children, no longer to be outside, and the young man no longer on the street. Speak this, thus saith the Lord." And I just want to say that actually we are in a spiritual warfare. This is spiritual warfare. And God is calling us back to take up an intercessory. And it's going to take prayer. It's going to take the hand of God to change some things. As we continue to pray, if each and every one of us will continue to pray, this is a spiritual problem. It's not a natural problem. It's a spiritual problem. It's spiritual warfare. We need to pray and take up a wailing and get some instructions, and some of these ideas that you have here, or some great things about the cameras and all those different things. But prayer is the main thing that's going to change things.
But prayer with no action does not work. Prayer, yes, you pray, but you have to come out of the churches and go into the community and talk to the kids. You have to have both. You have to have prayer, but you have to have action with that prayer.
You have to unleash the church from behind those four walls.
To live your faith.
Let's go to Tonya Caruso, who's with Tim Stevens. No, we're going over here to Tonya Caruso, please.
Here with Tim Stevens, chairman of the Black Political Empowerment Project, and you're carrying a lofty book here.
Lofty. This is the Coalition Against Violence document out of the Black Political Empowerment Project, also our Community Services Directory. We're about to launch these officially. We have begun to send these out. Page 5 of our document, this will be on bpep.net for those of you who want to get it, b-pep.net. And our page 5, we have actually 35 sections addressing violence from every angle possible. Our focus now, we meet every fourth Tuesday at 6 at Freedom Unlimited beside the NACP office in the Hill District to discuss how do we implement the document. We don't need another strategy. We've worked on this literally for years. Yesterday we were in council with Reverend Burgess and other council people. We were talking about how the housing problem in Homewood, all the demolition, creates an isolation, a sense of isolation. We talked about the young people and young adults getting jobs to help rebuild the housing stock that still exists, or clear the lots that have resulted from housing being torn down. Because part of the violence, the root of violence, is the inaccess or the absence of access to economic opportunities.
Mr. Stevens, is anybody listening to the recommendation?
We expect, our stand is that this document will get into action. We're having a mini summit Monday at Kappa with several schools. We're starting with the youth, as Marita Bryant stated. We have a document that starts with the role of the family and the community manifesto, what the community must do and what the family must do. But we have 33 other sections that has an opportunity for everybody in this room and everybody out there to take action. Communities of faith, the corporate community, agencies and organizations, youth themselves, everybody.
Are they on board, sir?
Well, we are getting great people. In the next year, our focus is pure implementation, mobilization, and partnership.
All right, we hope it works. Larry Leichhardt, does any of that work, from prayer to mobilization to getting corporate citizens involved and grassroots too?
I'm not sure whether that type of effort will be sustained. That's part of the basic problem with all our plans when we try to change a societal structure. It's never sustained. The money runs out, and basically things go back.
And that's
to where
Reverend
they were.
Burgess' fear, because a lot of those programs are not getting funded. Over to Michael Bartley, quickly, sir.
Time is short. Melissa Sickman is with the National Center of Juvenile Justice.
Yeah, we sort of do what the Bureau of Justice Statistics does for juvenile justice for the federal government, and we do a lot of work in Pennsylvania. We're located here in Pittsburgh. National statistics would take a look at kids, and you'd say that kids today are less violent than their parents were, because when you look at the arrest rates, the data would show that. That's not the case in Allegheny County, especially when it comes to violent crime, and I'm not sure why. Well, Allegheny County does not see the drops that we see even in the rest of Pennsylvania. And there are programs that work for kids. There's a website, crimesolutions.gov, that the federal government has put up that shows the things that work and the things that don't, so communities don't spend their money poorly. And I would ask, what is Allegheny County or City of Pittsburgh Police looking to do any of the things like the Boston Operation Ceasefire Project, which was shown to be effective?
That's PERC. That's the Pittsburgh Initiative to Reduce Crime.
Yeah, we implemented that. The mayor and I designed and implemented that program a couple of years ago. It's still functioning. It's a deterrent approach. There are other parts of the Boston plan that have not been implemented that I think we could implement it. There's a role for the churches to play. The problem, though, as always, is funding. Even when I introduced bringing cameras into Homewood, into Lincoln Lamar, along the ShotSpotter, I had to fight members of council who believed there was too much money to spend on in those communities. There's always a battle of funding. There is not a commitment to put resources in low and moderate income communities generally. There's certainly not a willingness to put disproportionate financing in the low and moderate income communities. But that's where the greatest need is, and I believe that's where the greatest funding should be.
Forgive me, sir. I thought the fight was over how it should be implemented and whether a new contract should be let or it could be enforced under the other one. It wasn't about money, but as Councilman Dowd said, about whether this would be an effective tool and a new contract needed to be let.
Well, as you know, there's always the public argument and there's the behind the scenes private argument. The private argument was that we were taking $1 million and putting it in low and moderate income communities in a way that was new. And so I believe the other arguments were really a distraction from the truth of trying to prevent those resources going to the communities where the technology is needed desperately.
Kim, we'll give you the last word on this.
My last word is simply this. There is a dearth of contact between state legislators and the citizens. We know it works. Maintaining old laws and old statutes, they don't work. They're a drain, a siphon on monies. They could help Reverend Burgess and Marita Bryant do their jobs better. But pursuing old-fashioned ways of looking at things is not going to work, and it hasn't worked.
All right. On that note, we're going to close the program out. We thank our panel for being here. We're just about out of time. A special thank you for all of our panelists for joining us. Michael and Tonya, you have some final thoughts for us.
All right, Chris, thank you indeed, and thank you all. And we also want to thank our wonderful and very respectful live audience here tonight. Thank you all, and thank you to our viewers for taking part in this very important discussion.
Indeed. And remember, you can watch this forum, both WQED documentaries, and our ongoing web series featuring personal stories from gun violence victims anytime online at wqed.org/gunviolence.
Thank you so much, and good night.